Okay. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Disruptive Minds. Today I'm here with Valentine Trent of iJility. You are listening to the Disruptive Minds podcast, home of the entrepreneur. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk a bit about labor management, especially how labor management really affects e-commerce sellers and 3PLs because we have a lot of seasonality, a lot of spikes, a lot of flexibility in the work that's done for both e-commerce merchants and 3PLs. So, what would you say the biggest labor challenges you see in that world are?
So I would say probably the largest is that operators think more bodies, more productivity, more product out. And that's not necessarily the case. And so I think that, they may carry labor throughout the entire year when they don't need to. And they're paying, out the wazoo for it. And then peak season comes. And so now they'll use it, but it's very painful, very expensive. And so, what I have really seen companies be greatly successful in is if they use some sort of outside labor. Maybe they have a core staff that are full time, and then they'll use some outside labor. Maybe it's temp help, something like that, where they can ebb and flow with the head count. Now, you do run into when you go into peak season, there's usually a very stark ramp, and you've got to have enough leadership and trainers in there to be able to get the people trained appropriately, or you're going to have massive turnover, and that's going to cost you a lot of money during peak too. So you have to kind of weigh those options and make sure that you've got the staff that you need in order to get that done.
Yeah, one of the things that I really think a lot of people miss is with labor, right? There's the principle of diminishing marginal returns, right? So for every person you add, right, especially if you're not adding the management labor, you're not adding the oversight labor, maybe you're bringing somebody in literally off the street. You're putting another body into the equation, which theoretically can do more work, but if they don't have the training, they don't have the know-how, they're not coming from a reputable agency or source, right? It's going to be hard to make that fit in, and you're actually going to have less output than what you anticipate, right? So if your packer's doing, let's say, 30 orders an hour, right,
Hmm.
and you bring in somebody from off the street, they might only do 13. Or if you bring somebody in from, let's say, a staffing agency or like a labor planning agency that where these people have at least some degree of warehouse experience, maybe you get 25, right? So
Well,
it
the other side of that too, Bill, is that when you bring in large amounts of people, even small amounts of people for that
yeah,
matter, if they're not doing what they need to be doing appropriately, it'll make your costs soar because you'll have a bunch of quality issues on the back end too, which is just, crazy because then you got to do a bunch of rework, and that is costly.
yeah, that's one that I think a lot of people really miss out on is like the cost of a mistake, right? Because if we're looking at it from the e-commerce side, right, a return, you might have to pay for the return label. Now that thing might not be sellable. So you have a loss of goods. You're paying to get back that inventory. You have credit card fees. You have all these things, not to mention the labor you put into that on the way out. Right, and it's a big
Mhm.
loss, especially on something where you might only have, a 15 or 20% margin if you're selling on
Right.
something like Amazon. Meanwhile, on the 3PL side, you have an even bigger problem because you're usually making pick fees, right? So think
Mhm.
you're making like a $1.75 for shipping that item out, and now you got to refund because it was clearly a packer error. And now
Mhm.
you have, maybe a 40 or $50 expense that you're going to
Mhm.
have to do a whole lot of free labor to make up.
Yes, and what I know about 3PLs, is that they are on razor thin margins typically at their sites, and so that type of thing could be very detrimental to them.
Yeah, like I said, it's that net impact of like a
Mhm.
2 or a 3% error rate is catastrophic
Mhm.
because, the cost of a return is usually pretty large
Right,
comparative to the cost you're making on a pick. So
right.
it really, really affects the 3PL industry, especially. And that's why, a lot of these 3PL companies have 99% plus accuracy rates because if they did, they'd be out of business quick.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And, if I may share a little bit about some things that we do that I believe could be very helpful, not even through agility, but just in general, conceptually, what really helps is if you can create an incentive program for these associates where you tie specific gates to it. And so you can tie quality, productivity, you can't tie safety anymore to incentives because OSHA just really does not like that. But you can also, tie productivity, right? So productivity, quality, and attendance. And if you play your cards right, people will do more because they're engaged in a way that traditional temp or traditional full time doesn't necessarily offer. So that's a really good way to sort of help yourself during those times, really year round. It's a great savings and a great program, but especially during a peak season.
Yeah, that's a really big one because if you can get away giving an incentive, right, and increasing your productivity overall, you know,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a 10 or 15% incentive, whether it's a lump sum or
Right.
a bonus or however you structure it, right,
Mm-hmm.
is a lot cheaper than bringing on a whole nother body.
Yes.
And like you said, you don't have that gap in knowledge that can
Mm-hmm.
often lead to the expensive and costly errors.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely a way to eke a little more performance out in a way
Right.
that's going to be beneficial, and you're going to get that A plus quality employee because those are guys that are trained by you. Those are guys that are working with your stuff all day, and they're people that you trust. So
For
one of the things I wanted to get into next was the idea of reducing labor costs, right? So you just kind of hit on that with
Mhm.
two really big points, which I kind of want to go back to, but I want to hear some other stuff too. So the one you gave me was, people are carrying labor in periods where they shouldn't be carrying labor, right?
Mhm.
So, the idea I think in the 3PL world is, the peak is coming, you want to have people in place. Yeah, the
Mhm.
customer's way too important to let down. So
Mhm.
you want to over plan and make sure you cover that. I think that's the thinking, but like you said, keeping extra employees all year round is pretty expensive. And the other thing, like you just said, incentive structure could, you know, mitigate some of those challenges at those peaks.
Right. For sure. So what I would say to that are a couple things. One is I'm going to talk a little bit about, obviously I'm going to pull from my frame of reference and talk about my organization and what we do, not from a this is exactly how you should do it, but from a hey, this is something that's been highly successful. Where maybe we are ingrained in a site year round, and I'm just going to use round numbers. Maybe we have 50 people on a shift, that's first shift, and maybe we're doing picking, and we're doing that on a cost per unit year round. And then peak season comes and they need to ramp and open a third shift that does not normally exist. We have migrated those full time first shift, because they're full time with us,
Right.
first shift folks over to the third shift, ramped that up for maybe a 10-week period, added 300 people, trained them, got the work out, and then when peak was over, collapsed that shift and moved those people back to first. So that's a really good way to use outside labor, even inside labor if you choose to do it on your own,
Yeah.
but to do it in a way that you're not carrying it, right? And then the incentive, cannot stress enough that if you set the gates right, that engagement level is becomes so high because people feel like they control their destiny a little bit. Again, it's not just I'm showing up to work and I get paid what I get paid no matter how well I do. Yeah, I might lose my job if I don't do a good job, but I have no way to make more money. And this is a way that really helps get those people to say, okay. So they don't have to be full time with the company in order to make them feel that level of engagement. Does that
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying even usually with the temp people, it's good to incentivize them as well. And I think that's a really interesting point because I think a lot of people, they love their employees. They want to take care of their employees. They want to see them succeed. So, the idea of like award structure or bonuses and things like that sound really appealing. But I
Mhm.
think a lot of times people exclude
Yes.
that reoccurring group of labor that they really rely on most when they need it most, right?
Right.
Like these are the you know they might not be your A team, but these are the guys who are right there in the pits of the moment.
Yes.
They're tackling Q4 with you. They're doing all those those tougher periods in your building, right? Like they're not
Yes.
the guys handling that September slump. They're the ones you know
Right.
shoveling things in the back of the UPS truck on December 23rd, right?
Mhm.
So,
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Or when these companies that do these, that are e-com that do these flash sales
yeah,
and things like that. But what I find is so this is something that's important to note.
yeah,
Because we at Agility live inside of our customers' four walls year round and then ebb and flow with volume, depending on where we're at. That's, I think, part of what makes it successful too. So I think it's important that while I'm saying don't hang on to a bunch of labor, what I think is important for people to consider is maybe you do an 80-20 split in your building, a 70-30, a 60-40, or a 20 full-time, 80 temp if it's all fourth quarter,
yeah.
ramp. It just depends on what's going on in their world.
Yeah, so you hit on something I thought was pretty interesting there, which is the fact that since you're living in those walls, you have an idea what's going on. You know where the peaks, where the valleys, where everything is, right? And this brings up something on the 3PL side that I think a lot of people overlook, which is the level of communication between customer and 3PL, right?
Mhm.
So if you're an e-commerce merchant and you're doing these big flash sales, like you said, you got to let the 3PL know. It sounds obvious, right? It's like laughable here. But like the amount of times I've seen again and again,
Mhm.
especially because, at Racklify, we get a lot of inbound leads for 3PLs where someone's like upset at their 3PL because they didn't handle a peak or a sale right, but
Okay.
they never inform the
Right.
3PL, right? And you
Mhm.
find this out later, but I've seen it again and again. And this ecosystem of labor is, it's a beautiful thing, but it's also a fragile thing where it needs to be cultivated, right? And the more information you have, the better decisions you can make
Yes.
regarding your labor, right? And
Information.
if you can use that information to make more informed decisions about how you're
Mhm.
handling the labor, you're going to have more success. And that's something that the merchant, right, or the person using a 3PL
Mhm.
should want to be involved in as well.
Yes. And I would also say on a completely different note, but same topic, so to speak,
Yeah.
you want to be very careful as an employer, whether you're the merchant, whether you're the 3PL, and no matter who you are, that you're not damaging your reputation in your market because then employees don't want to come there because they feel
Mhm.
like they've been jerked around or not told the truth. And that's not even necessarily what's gone on. It's the lack of communication, to your
Right.
point.
Communication is key. And, you just kind of hit on it there. And I want to dig into that is the idea that, employees do talk, right? They have networks, they have families, and they have friends, and they, go to
Right.
the bar on Friday too. Right? So word does get around in these. And one of the things that's really important, whether they're your employees, whether it's temp agency, whether it's, a solution like Agility, is having retention, right? Having those people that show up every day, they know the job. You're not spending tons of money on training. Like people really forget
Mhm.
how much they spend on training, right? How
Yes.
much lost productivity there is there in
Yes.
bringing somebody up to speed. So retention is a big thing. So
Mhm.
how do you see, best practices for retaining employees and making sure that, they have positive things to say about your company?
Yeah. So I think the very first thing I'm going to say, believe it or not, is not money. It is absolutely how you treat them. And that word communication is 100% capitalized. Cannot stress it enough. If they feel like you've got their back and you're there with them, which again, we live with them. It's not like we're
Right.
just placing them. So it's much easier for us
Right.
because of that compared to just a temp help company. But I think how you treat them and making them feel like they are important because they are. It without them, we wouldn't have a job. I mean,
Yeah.
bottom line, right? And so, and then you and I as consumers wouldn't have our products because there'd be
Right.
nobody there to pick them and ship them and so forth. So I think that is the number one thing. I think the number two thing is maybe opportunity for growth. Do they feel like they can grow here in some way? They don't have to
Mhm.
want to be the president, but can they go somewhere? And so really that sort of goes hand in hand with the value. Do they feel valued? Right. And then I would say last would be pay, believe it or not. And I can't stress enough the incentive pay piece and how
Yeah.
well that works for us.
So something you said there about growth, right? And I think a lot of people kind of miss that part because they think like, hey, this person has to go from associate to lead to manager to supervisor, right?
Right.
Like that's how they see growth. But
Right.
growth can be as simple as adding a different responsibility or
Mhm.
another task, right? So, like, think about it this way: if you have a packer, right? Maybe
Mhm.
that guy starts out on the packing station, he's just packing all day. But maybe he eventually becomes the material guy. He's responsible for not just packing, but making sure that you guys have materials in stock at the beginning of the day, making sure the stations are stocked. And that's an additional, you know, role that's not something where you're like, oh, now this guy's the lead because he handles the packaging materials. It's
Right.
something where, he might get a 50 cent or $1 raise, an extra responsibility added, and he feels like he now matters and has more impact, right?
Yes. Yes. I also think it's pretty important to consider, just feel good things for employees, lunches, brought in, things of that nature. Maybe you run a little contest. We have something that we do a lot of where it's, are you being safe? It has a lot to do with safety because when we go into sites, because we do the directing of the employees at the
Mhm.
site, all the workers' comp and OSHA falls on us. And so that customer no longer has to track our people on their OSHA log because we're responsible for them. And, I think hey, you were caught doing something really good today. And then their name goes, from a safety perspective, and then their name goes into a bowl and you draw it and, you give a gift card. Very simple, but just little things like that, I think are pretty critical.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is pretty interesting that you just brought up there is, in the 3PL world, gift cards are a really good way to do this. And the reason why they're such a good way to do this is I'm sure you all have an Amex card, right?
Mhm,
I'm sure everybody's got FedEx points, right?
mhm,
So what are you currently using these points for, right? And
mhm,
some people use them to get office supplies, some people use them for
mhm.
travel, some people use them for different things, but one of the things you can use them for is employee incentives, right?
Yeah.
So you can use some of those Amex points, go get an iPad, go
Yep.
get a gift card,
Yep.
go use the FedEx points, do the same thing. And the 3PLs, they all have these things. And the
Mhm,
question is, are you using them, right? You'd be shocked how many business owners don't tap into those credit card points. And they got mountains of millions of credit card points. And their
mhm.
employees would absolutely love, a $50 Texas Roadhouse gift card.
Yes. It's sometimes it's the very simple thing. It's kind of like what I always say about a marriage. It's the
Yeah.
little things that sort of keep you going. And I think it's the same thing, with an employee because it is sort of a marriage, if you will. And you want to one other thing that I would say on the personal note of employees is, if you are able to find out what's important to them, you might even help them grow personally
Mhm.
versus giving them 50 more cents an hour. That's another way that you can help them grow.
Right.
It doesn't, cost a whole lot. So just things like that I think are good to consider.
Yeah. So one of the things we've been talking about is communication. It is informed decisions, right? Using data, using real-time things, right?
Mhm,
So one of the keys here is, how technology fits into this entire puzzle, right? Because
mhm,
there's a lot of managers out there still using back of the napkin math, right? We got 2,000 orders, currently with a team of 6 guys, I'm getting out 1,200. That means I need 3 more, right? How can you use, basic technology and systems to make better decisions?
Well, so let me just give you a very quick backstory. So we have industrial engineers on our staff that go into our prospective sites and then even our current customers, as we grow with
Mhm.
them. And they do time and motion studies and determine what the customer's current cost per unit is to do that we are able to actually save our customers anywhere from 10 to 20% on a cost per unit and increase their output by sometimes 15 to 30%, especially if you're talking about compared to temp help.
Right.
And so, what they have used and created, they meaning our team, they've put together a system that allows us to track and then pay this incentive pay. And so, we really typically latch on to a customer's LMS and
Mhm.
sort of pull some of our data from that and then dump it into our system. And that's how we pay. The other thing that we do with any sort of like we work with robotics. And so we're in customers today where they were using robots, and it's not that they weren't being successful, but they weren't getting their ROI. Not
Yeah.
really. And so we went in and helped understand that system. And in the past 3 years, we've saved them over $1.5 million, increased their output threefold in this area to where they've now gone back out and invested in more bots. So
Mhm.
it really can be a very good thing. But what we find is a lot of times those robotic companies, even as great as they are, they'll come in, they'll implement it, and then they leave it, kind of like a consultant,
Yeah.
right? And then you're left to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Well, that's one of the things that we do with the labor. And if there's technology involved, we'll make sure that it's continuing to give that productivity and increase, that output that they've sold them on, so to speak.
Yeah. The robotics is definitely getting better. I heard some horror stories years ago, but a lot of that's been cleaned up. So
Mhm.
I'd urge people to give people another chance, but at the same time, be cautious. But
Yes.
one of the things that you said that I really, really clung to was the idea that you guys actually figure out like the cost per action or the cost per
Hmm.
and the thing is, when I talk to 3PLs, one of the common questions I get is, how do I get my pricing right? How do I know my pricing? And the problem with the 3PL conundrum is Philadelphia is very different than Dallas, which is very
Right.
different than Salt Lake, which is very different than Nashville, Tennessee.
Right.
And it's different from a rent perspective. It's different from a labor perspective, right?
Mhm.
It's impossible to have a one size fits all option. And if you're going to be competitive in your particular geographic area,
Mhm.
the best way to do that is to understand what the costs in your area are and
Right.
build that into your pricing model. So
Mhm.
by knowing how much in labor expense is actually going into performing that task can
Mhm.
help you get that pricing right and help you win that
Yes.
customer where you're not overselling yourself, where
Mhm.
you're charging too much and you're not winning anything, but you're also not going so low that you're losing money by performing necessary actions and
Right.
then the customer is suffering.
Right. And, we have unofficially partnered with at least 5 BPL companies over the past 2 years, and then many more before that, where we're helping them behind the scenes price new business from the labor perspective. They've partnered with us, and the only, I would say, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, is we're going to help you with the pricing, but then we want the labor behind it. We
Right.
want to help you do that. And it's been a huge win for
Yeah.
all parties.
Yeah, like I said, that's the key to getting your 3PL
Mhm.
pricing right and really understanding what you're doing with that pricing because a lot of like newer 3PL owners don't understand that there's a variance in the costs around the country, right? They think because you got some guy in Texas beating you by 25 cents a pick that it's
Mhm.
the same as your, LA based fulfillment center in downtown Los
Right.
Angeles.
Right.
And it's important that you understand the difference. But
Right.
I thought all this was really, 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 really important to get down because a lot of people don't understand labor. It's kind of a mystery. And
Mhm.
I really enjoyed having this conversation. But I was wondering, do you have like one or two parting thoughts, like real key takeaways that you think somebody should remember from this? And could you tell us a little bit more about agility?
Okay, so I would say the takeaway is a lot of times I sound like I'm selling for temp help, and I'm not, but a lot of times have had really bad experiences.
Yeah.
And so they just, I'm just going to I'm just not doing that. They don't care. They don't this, they don't that. Not everybody's like that. And I'll tell you in just a few moments how we're not like that and what we do stand for and why I think it's different. So I think give it a try. And then I think that the second thing is don't just throw bodies at the problem. Let's find the root of it and then let's make that better. Let's fix the process. Let's fix the, hey, don't touch that 5 times, only touch it once. Whatever this situation is. And then for some words about iJility, I would say to you, iJility is a labor management firm. We focus on the returns sector, e-commerce, B2B, food, automotive, life science. We're extremely successful from running a building. We're not a 3PL. We don't own the equipment. We don't own the building. We don't own the WMS. But we can flat come in there. You can have a black belt team of your own that interfaces with your customer, and we will run it for you with very specific KPIs. We do it on a cost per unit, which is that guaranteed fixed labor rate. Again, we save our customers anywhere from 10 to 20% doing that. We do not think we can do it better than you. We know we can do it better than temps. And so we always say we're like temp help, but better. Our leadership, our supply chain operators, manufacturers, people who come from that world, they live on the site, they drive the productivity and guarantee the quality. So part of our program is if we make a quality infraction, we rework it on our dime. And so therefore the associate will feel that because they won't get their incentive that week. But we do it weekly from an incentive basis. So if they fall off the wagon this week, they can start right back up next week. It's not, I have a whole month and I'm not going to work hard because I'm not going to make it, my incentive this month. So I would say to you that we're only in the United States. That's really where we want to stay. We're very, very interested in being partner friendly with people that we work with. A lot of people use that word. They don't really understand what it means. We are looking upstream, downstream, any way that we can be of value to our customer. And we've been quite successful in doing it.
Yeah, I think one of the things you started off with there that really caught my attention was, you said you didn't want to pitch for temp labor, but the idea that people try it, they hate it, then they decide we're just going to do this all in, right? And what I think is really important is the idea that you find a partner,
Yes.
not just a solution, right?
Yes.
Like anybody can throw you bodies,
Right.
but the question is who's going to understand what you need,
Right.
what kind of people you need, and fit that solution into your
Yes.
actual operation. Because I've worked with probably a dozen different temp agencies over the last decade. And what you find is that some are better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Some understand your business. Some people don't even understand what you do,
Mm-hmm.
and some just throw bodies. And when you find a partner that works for you,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really beautiful thing, right?
It is. It is. And, one other thing that I didn't mention that I think is notable is that when we come into the sites, we've got engagement teams that come again from supply chain and our engineering, and they will write SOPs. They'll take customers' SOPs if they already have them, update them. They can lay out floor plans. I mean, they can do so many things. And all of that is just a part of the service, which is definitely not temp help.
Yeah, no, that's really awesome. Like I said, all these other little bells and whistles here, I think are really the big differentiating point here because
Mhm.
understanding your labor, having the data, right, and being able to make these changes and have experts that can help guide you when it
Mhm.
comes down to the crunch, right? When it's 4 days before Christmas,
Right.
that's really where the value is. And I,
Yes.
I think it's really important.
Yep.
Well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Disruptive Minds. We enjoyed having you. Come back. We're going to have more insightful conversations with more insightful people. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.